housekeeping. So I will try to give something of an overview of the process and set some tone, but and you'll see a number of slides that will come up again in the subsequent talks, and you'll be getting sort of the nuts and bolts of things in those other presentations. So don't be surprised if at some point a question is asked of me and I refer you to upcoming presentations. Oops. So the two topics I generally like to cover at this time are what is the range plan and what is our assessment and planning process. Look at the process and where we are at, how we got to this point of the process. There was two governments. Where's the government involved? Environment Canada and ourselves, the primary participants. Our efforts are focused on developing range plans for woodland caribou, which is in the blue circle in the upper corner. Let me see if I can get this laser to work. That's where we're targeted. That's what we are headed for and working towards today. From the federal perspective, the Environment Canada's perspective, they're responsible for the SARA, the Species at Risk Act, which spawn, if you would, the recovery strategy for the woodland caribou, and in turn led them to require three things. An action plan, which lays out in totality, if you would, the overall approach to dealing with the caribou situation, and asking for three things: the action plan, woodland caribou range plan, and directed studies, as we call them, a schedule of studies, if you happen to have read the federal document, that gives us the opportunity to provide them with information on the status of the caribou in our SK1 area. From the provincial perspective, the provincial side, we have a draft conservation strategy in place that helps guide our activities. That was developed almost concurrently, if you would, with the federal recovery strategy, so many of the objectives, goals, targets, and approaches considered are pretty much aligned with each other, and so the intent and focus are very much aligned. To move our provincial recovery plan towards responding to the federal recovery strategy requirements, the range assessment program was undertaken and will involve input from government, industry, First Nations, Métis, NGOs, and all the concerned stakeholders. Excuse me. When we have put together the woodland caribou range plan and helped and have completed the directed studies, that those will be used by Environment Canada and in the crafting of the final action plan. We trust there will be ongoing communication and discussion with Environment Canada while that final document is being prepared, and so hopefully our points of view and needs will be addressed at that time. The range plans. The range plans are really documents that outline how a given range will be managed to ensure that critical habitat is protected from destruction. It's in essence, if you would, a land use plan focused on caribou. In there, excuse me, there will be a decision support tools developed that will look at an integrated package of reports and maps that identify risks to the population, the caribou population, and its viability, establishes management objectives, and looks at actions that we can undertake to help meet those objectives. There's no single prescriptive approach on how to develop a range plan, and various jurisdictions are in the position of having to select or develop approaches that they consider most appropriate for their situation. But we do need to incorporate certain things. A cumulative effects approach has to be incorporated into the planning. They have to include such things as a demonstration of how at least 65% of the undisturbed habitat in the range will be maintained or achieved if we are not at that level. We have to include a list of the provincial laws, regulations, permits, and so forth, and other conservation measures that will be used to help prevent activities that are likely to destroy critical habitat. They'll include maps of land tenure so that the federal government will have an understanding of who is responsible where. And where we believe as a group that we lack sufficient protection measures, the range plan should indicate what steps are being taken by us to bring ourselves to a place where we can address those gaps, and a timeline for doing so. So if we feel that there's a regulation that's required to achieve something, or through the environmental code, a set of standards that's needed, we'll be working with our interested stakeholders, the First Nations and Métis people, to achieve those standards and bring them into force. So, the range assessment, range planning. I think we need to realize that the assessment will assist us in a number of ways in terms of going forward to the range planning part of the process. Range assessments will help us understand both the natural disturbance and man-made disturbances that influence caribou. We'll have an improved understanding of the status of our caribou population and how they are increasing or decreasing over time. We hope to gain understandings of caribou predator interactions, how reforestation following a disturbance influences their populations, and how long it takes after disturbance for a habitat to actually begin to meet the needs of caribou. And so these are all risks that we need to deal with. These risks are basically being expressed as threats to a sustainable caribou population and to sustainable caribou habitat. The process will result in reports, maps, the usual tools of our trade, if you would, to help guide us into the management of the proposed and ongoing land use activities. Range plans were defined by Environment Canada as an outline of how range-specific land and/or resource activities will be managed over space and time to ensure that critical habitat for woodland caribou is protected from destruction. So it has to reflect the disturbance patterns on the landscape, propose management procedures to address that disturbance, and how to manage into the future an ongoing and what will be a very dynamic state and pattern of suitable habitats. The plan will be developed by the province with input from stakeholders, and we need to recognize that project-by-project assessments, while helping understand a particular process or circumstance around a given development, is only part of an overall cumulative effects approach. They work hand in glove, but they don't stand alone. So the range assessments will indeed contribute most effectively to the cumulative effects assessment and then development of current and future approaches to management. This was to try and illustrate the boundaries, if you would, of the SK1 and the SK2 areas that were referred to by our Assistant Deputy Minister earlier. SK1 being the boreal shield, and it extends from the northernmost coloration that we have there down to the interface with the boreal shield and boreal plain demarcation. That would be SK1. The SK2 runs from that same boreal shield, boreal plain demarcation and boundary south to the current, roughly to the current southern limit of the woodland caribou. Okay, it does not incorporate all of the boreal plain, but merely goes south to the limit of the caribou distribution at this time. So, due to the large nature of these two conservation units and the variation across them of the human or anthropogenic disturbance, it's anticipated that we will need to actually produce a number of range plans that span the area and take into account this variability. The level of overall risk and how it varies across the range will contribute, therefore, to defining and prioritizing range plan areas and the number of plans needed. Other information that will contribute to how we finally craft those boundaries, if you would, for those areas will be: what do we know about the local caribou populations? What do we know about the human use pattern and our settlement pattern? What are the dominant resource extraction uses? What are the other administrative boundaries that exist on the land? And all of these things combined will have to be taken into consideration in determining where those final boundaries are established for the individual range plans. So, range assessment leads into range planning, and you will see this particular diagram come up a little later on in my presentation and in the presentations to follow, because it does lay out a very clear pathway from start to hopefully successful conclusion. So the range assessment part is a necessary process to evaluate the habitat condition and determine the population status in each of the ranges. That information is then used to guide the range planning process, with the ultimate objective being the development of the range plan itself. It's a 6-step procedure that involves scoping, characterizing the range condition, characterizing the level of risk, defining the management objectives and strategies, determining which strategies to apply, how and where and when, and ultimately monitoring the results, evaluating the results of those activities, and adapting them to the changing circumstances, and based on what we found in our monitoring, new scientific information that may have come forward, and other concerns that may have arisen in the interim. At the end of the day, the plan, as I said, is the first objective. Once that plan is in place, the process does not end. As I say, there will be monitoring that will lead to evaluation, adaptation, and depending on what we discover at that point, we may have to reinvestigate certain aspects of the range assessment. We may have to bring in new concepts or ideas, adapt our management strategies, follow it through to the end point again, monitor it, evaluate it, and repeat. At the moment, a 5-year cycle is required of us. So, how are we going to transition from our assessment to the range planning? The idea here is that we will be producing a team, a core planning team. We have ministry representatives from a variety of professional backgrounds and experience, and who also have sound local knowledge from a particular planning region. As I say, this is the core planning team from the ministry's perspective. There are other tables and planning groups that I will introduce in a few slides hence, that reflect the need for involvement of First Nations, Métis, industry, NGOs, and stakeholders. So, just a quick overview of the steps. So, the initial issue scoping provides the initial direction on how to focus what it is we need to be addressing. It helps to illustrate for us additional studies that may be required, what additional information may be needed. Identifies, therefore, knowledge gaps and issues from the early engagements that we've had, from early direction we've received. It's an iterative process. There is no doubt in anyone's minds that what you hear today is going to stay static through time. Things will change, things will evolve. we need to keep on top of those kinds of changes to make sure we're addressing what needs to be addressed. The initial scoping was conducted primarily internally by the ministry and largely overlaps with issues already defined and identified by the federal strategy and through the Woodland Caribou conservation strategy of the province, which was a long, inclusive process that involved many of the people and organizations that are here today. So we had a nice base to start from because of that former work with the First Nations and Métis and industry from the past. The next step would be the characterization of the range. Here, the information we were looking for was to give us an idea of what is the condition of the range and how that may support the planning process as we go forward. And in fact, research studies are underway, including radio collaring, telemetry studies, examinations of the effects of fire and human disturbance on the habitat, collection of Aboriginal knowledge, and the gathering of genetic information on the caribou. We'll learn a bit more about this in the subsequent talks. The core planning team will then guide the range characterization process as we move forward, and further steps that may be needed to get us to where we can begin to set objectives and the measurements. It's anticipated that additional information requirements will be identified and examined, and those results incorporated in future iterations of our plan. Characterization of the risk. This is, in many respects, the part of the process that lays out what we need to focus on first, second, and third, if you would. To me, this is the point where we begin to establish priorities based on some foundation of fact. Okay. So the ministry will characterize the current level of risk across the caribou habitat through this initial state of assessment, and in the iterations that follow, that future state will again be re-examined. We expect that these assessments will take 6 to 9 months to complete, given the size and the complexity of the areas we're dealing with, and the current amount and expected future amount of human activity. The range itself, as I mentioned before, will be stratified based on human disturbance, wildfire disturbance, and potential caribou habitat. And the outcomes of those assessments will be used to highlight and prioritize the range planning boundaries. One thing here, if people are looking at our documentation and looking at the federal documentation from Environment Canada, it's important to note that the human disturbance mapping we've done is at a finer scale than the current Environment Canada disturbance maps. We have not, however, been able to look at the level of regrowth or recovery that has occurred to date that will enable us to take some of this disturbance off of the map. That will take field work, measuring the regrowth and response of those disturbances to some level of characterization or criteria that has yet to be established. The point being, we've mapped everything to a very fine scale, much finer than Environment Canada's. However, we also recognize that some of those things have been on the land for a while. They may have recovered sufficiently. We need to ascertain if they have or they have not, and that will again change the final numbers that we base our work upon. So that is going to be an essential part of this whole range plan process, and we are going to need your participation and direct input with this inventory to help us clarify what is existing man-made disturbance on the landscape, and then to ultimately determine how we will manage it in relation to the federal strategy's thresholds. So participation in or contribution to these studies to establish these mitigation or recovery practices that are relevant to your industry will be necessary, and more importantly, will be your direct participation in the planning, reclamation, and mitigation work across the entire planning area. So, we've gotten through the first part, the assessment part. So basically, there's no point in me trying to go into much detail on this map, other than to, or on this figure, other than to say we're going to take the information we've gathered from traditional knowledge, from the forest ecosite classification work that's gone on, expert opinion to develop the habitat map, the center of the three top bars. We'll look at what we know about from the telemetry work and the genetics, look at the population status and trend, and combine those two things, the habitat and the population trends and statuses, overlay that with the disturbances, both human or anthropogenic, and fire, and that will lead us to a point where we can begin to look at the risk levels associated with the woodland caribou and their habitat. So, once we have that, I think we'll have a fairly robust understanding of the state of affairs. So now on to moving forward. Defining the management objectives and performance measures. This map comes from the Federal Recovery Strategy, so if you look at it and say, I recognize it, that's why. So we've come to the point where, as I say, we now have a fairly robust understanding of the current situation, and we want to get on with the planning. So after the range planning areas have been identified, prioritized, we'll initiate our work on the area that we believe has the highest risk with respect to the caribou. It's at this stage that we will begin to more directly and fulsomely engage with stakeholders, land users, First Nations, Métis, industry, and the key stakeholders. This step will begin to help us determine the best land use scenario. It'll help define the management objectives, determine the performance measures that we should be tracking. We'll look at the management strategies to move forward to achieving the overall objective of meeting the 65% undisturbed habitat threshold. Consistency in using this engagement structure that we're about to give you a little more information on here is going to be important to ensure that we get fair contribution in the range planning process from all the key players, the First Nations, the Métis, not only in the first place we begin to look at range planning, but across the entire province as we go forward. We will not obviously be doing the whole province in one fell swoop. So we want to make sure that we follow a consistent process that engages the same groups of people in a similar fashion across the entirety of the province. So here's our thinking. We'll have our core range planning team, as I mentioned before, made up of ministry people. We need to have engagement at individual tables with key people of the province. A table with First Nations, a separate table with the Métis, and a separate table with the industry, NGOs, municipal folks, so that we can discuss issues, management strategies that are of importance to them. Get their input, get their ideas, get their concerns if we propose something, to make sure that there is alignment to the highest degree possible. Further, we also need an integrated range planning table where we bring all the groups together to ensure that everyone has a chance to also understand and explain it and have interchange amongst the whole. So this table, it's in the handout. Take a moment, look at it, give it some thought. I believe you'll find that it's an equitable way of going about business, as well as being efficient and functional. So, we start. Once we have introduced ourselves at these various interest tables and planning tables, we can then move forward to begin to develop a suite of management strategies that will be designed to maintain appropriate habitat levels for caribou, but also have to be practical from the standpoint of being applied to land use and use of the land. These strategies will include guidance and direction on the state of caribou habitat, integrating of best practices, access management, temporal habitat availability, management activities that are intended to maintain or increase critical habitat for woodland caribou. As I mentioned earlier, laws, regs, standards that we feel we may need or may not need to bring those into play. We anticipate that because we do wish to engage with all the people, as I mentioned in those interest tables and in the integrate table, we can see this stage taking up to 2 years to complete. You don't meet with people and engage their ideas and their concerns and walk away and a day later have the answer. It just doesn't work. So we are anticipating that that's this stage. Once we enter into it, will probably take upwards to 2 years to complete. The final of the 6, the monitoring and adaptation. Even though it's the province's responsibility to report monitoring results, we are obviously going to require support from land users to gather the information. The range plans will be updated with new pertinent information and reassessed every 5 years. So as the monitoring goes on, we become aware of things that are working, things that are not working up to potential, or things that just aren't working at all. We are going to have to refine this plan, and as I said earlier, a 5-year cycle is what's expected. Performance measures will be developed for each range plan to measure the efficiency of the various strategies as outlined in the plan, and those will be the focus of our efforts and what we would ask you to assist us in achieving. We will have things fall off the wall from time to time. The province will seek assistance from land users in supporting the collection of population and habitat information as it pertains to their specific activities that they engage in on the land, as well as to the overall plan process. Okay, so earlier on you saw a chart that looked very similar to this one. It took us to the point of having addressed our assessment portion. It goes to the next step, which is the beyond the assessment to the management planning. And again, all those things that can contribute to a land use planning scenario that we are currently aware of, and we'll learn more as we meet with the various tables, I'm sure. All those things, the initial risk assessment, the existing land use strategies, plans, zoning, frameworks, forest management plans, environmental assessment information, Aboriginal traditional knowledge, things that are coming down the pipe in terms of development, potential developments. All of those things will have to be melded together to produce a land use planning scenario that's sort of in the pale blue box up there. That's the first part. We need to then incorporate what we learn from that integrated planning table, from the interest tables with the First Nations, from the interest table with the Métis, from the interest table from industry and NGOs and municipal people. Those things all combined will help us determine the management objectives, create strategies, and when you lump those three things together, we're hoping that that's what will lead to the actual Woodland Caribou Range Plan document. And it will include things such as access and restoration plans, what are the best practices, operational guidelines, and any other elements that we feel are necessary to put together a proper management plan for the woodland caribou and woodland caribou habitat. And as the red arrow indicates, live, learn, adapt, start again. In this case, on a 5-year cycle. That adaptive management, I know people have heard it time and time again. The beauty of it is it does allow us to live and use the land while improving how we're managing the land. So that red arrow, simple as it looks, is perhaps in some respects the most valuable go forward part on this particular slide. Fortunately for you good people, I'm down to 2 slides. Range plan, feedback and approvals. The plans will obviously be undergoing review. First, internal review by stakeholders and the local groups, and the general public will have 60 days to review it. Comments and feedback will be taken into consideration and the draft plan revised as needed. The revised plan would then be submitted for approval by our minister, and that's what would ultimately be submitted to Environment Canada to address their requirements under their recovery strategy. I believe this table is also in your handout, so I won't spend any time on it. That gives you what we are hoping will be more or less our guidelines for initiation and completion of various activities related to the range planning process. The target, as you can see there, is toward the end of 2017. Seems like a long way off when you look at the amount of work we have before us. This is going to be a marathon race, people. We are going to have to work together, and sometimes in places we're going to have to redouble effort to achieve this timeline. It is a very ambitious timeline when one considers, as I say, the size of Saskatchewan and the complexity of the issues before us. And I think that terminates me. So, if there's a couple of quick questions, I'm not sure if I'm even on time anymore. I never watch the clock.